Chapter 1. The Beginning. A note from l-Ryn-l. This is my first work of writing. Any comments or reviews are welcome. Smiley face. Julian woke up staring at the sky, the sun glaring down at him. How did I survive that fall? There was no way he should have been anything other than a pancake on the forest floor. He also had a huge migraine that was like a jackhammer inside his head. Rolling over and trying to get to his feet, he feels off, like there was a disconnect between his mind and body. All of a sudden, he felt a massive rush of information inside his head. Things he previously did not know were now suddenly just there. Names and faces, his favorite food, years of memories were jammed into his brain at an unprecedented rate. It was overwhelming. The pain, the sheer amount of information. It felt like someone was trying to shove his brain into a jar the size of his fist. He felt blood dripping down his face, and unable to take the pain, he fell unconscious. Gwyneth was a retainer of House Hyperius. She has worked for the noble house for over 2 years now. Originally, she was an adventurer and their party's support mage. Reaching tier 3 with healing abilities, she received many offers from powerful houses and guilds. However, she chose House Hyperius because having the backing of one of the most influential powers on the continent was very appealing. On top of the generous pay, they also offered to sponsor her to tier 4, teaching her things that only those from established powers would be able to. It was a no-brainer. All it would require from her was to watch one of their young scions. A brat just over 7 years old. It was an easy job, she just had to bathe and feed him. Otherwise, he would just play around all day around the estate, while she tried to advance. However, Julius always came back when the sun started setting because he had to eat supper, which is why she wondered where he was. It was almost time for his meal, and he never missed anything regarding food. Feeling slightly nervous, Gwen started to search for him around the estate. Stopping to ask various workers around the property if they had seen the young master, she continued her search. She eventually found him lying beside a tree on the edge of the property. Probably took a little nap after running around so much, she laughed to herself. Gwen walked up to him in order to wake him up. Though when she got closer, she noticed that there was blood running down his nose, collecting in a puddle beneath his face. Panicking, she quickly rushed towards him and activated diagnosis. Her skill allowed her to see that Julius had a minor brain bleeding. Completely shocked as to why or how it happened, she quickly used advanced heal. She carefully dissolved the excess blood filling his brain and slowly reduced the swelling. Once she stabilized his condition, she started channeling small amounts of healing mana throughout his body. It was probably overkill, considering that his head was the only injury, but she had plenty of mana, and this wasn't a time to be stingy with it. After a few seconds, she could see the tension in his face relax, and she released the breath she didn't know she was holding. Cleaning up most of the blood all over his face, she carefully picked him up and carried him back to the mansion. She could not begin to imagine what might have happened if he had died under her watch. He might not have been the most important young son of the prestigious family, but she didn't want to find out what they would do to her if he died. Chapter 2. He tries. It's been a week since the incident, and Julius has finally started to sort through the clutter of memories. The first important memory of note was that he was the son of Gregor von Hyperius, one of many younger brothers of Lucas von Hyperius, the current patriarch of House Hyperius. House Hyperius was awarded the rank of Marquis centuries ago by the Emperor for its achievements during the Great War. It governed over the Valorbary region, a large territory with many smaller houses underneath it. He didn't know who his mother was and had only seen his father a handful of times. It seemed like his father and family overall did not particularly care about Julius. His father had returned to the estate several times over the years, but during that period, he had not visited Julius a single time. Not even a birthday note. Nothing. Compared to other great houses, there were not many members of House Hyperius. The most recent monster flood took the lives of many of their elites. For a house that made its name for its martial prowess, this was a major blow to its power. Their remaining elites, few were either offered better options from more powerful factions or wanted to settle down to start families of their own. This meant that House Hyperius was under pressure from the remaining great houses, having lost much of its influence and holdings over the past decade. It was only due to the strength of their patriarch that they weren't swallowed up entirely. Reaching Tier 5 before turning 40, Lucas von Hyperius was considered one of the most talented individuals of his generation. His talent was what made the former patriarch name him his successor. However, when the former patriarch died in the prior monster flood, Lucas was still under 50 years old but was widely known as one of the most powerful Tier 5s in the Empire. Julius had many questions. There were so many questions that he wasn't able to answer. He was restricted to a few areas of the estate. There was something about his circumstances that confined him to the estate. He was not allowed to visit other areas and most of the time had to eat his meals in the kitchen or his room. To be fair, the estate was massive. The mansion alone would make Bruce Wayne's mansion feel like a studio apartment in comparison. It could comfortably house hundreds, and the land it sat on was even more ridiculous. So, even if you lived together, you could go years without seeing each other. So he couldn't say it was even that bad. He had more space than he did in his previous life. With that being said, it was lonely being confined in these prison-like conditions. Reviewing his memories, he found himself pitying the former Julius. There weren't many children his age around in the first place, and the ones who were already had their groups. At 7 years old, the only people he had interactions with were Gwen, Edwin, and a handful of workers, and even then, they were employees of the house, not his friends. It was also important to note that none of his blood relatives interacted with him during these 7 years. For the previous Julius, this was a curse. However, for the new Julius, this was a blessing in disguise. Because while he was confined to this part of the estate, he was free to do whatever he wanted as long as he remained inside the compound. Because of this, he didn't need to worry about pretending to be a 7-year-old child all the time. But it was odd that in all these years, his family treated him like he didn't exist. Another unanswered question. However, there was one thing that he was very excited about. Magic. It seemed that magic was possible in this world and that everyone had the ability to use it to some extent. It also had something to do with skills. The memories he gained lacked many details, but he understood they were important. According to Gwen, he would learn more after his baptism when he was 12. Unfortunately, even after pressing her for more answers, she said the house restricted her about what she could tell him. Magic and skills were apparently what allowed him to recover so quickly. His caretaker, Gwen, was an accomplished healer and found him outside unconscious. From there, she healed him, and within a day, he awoke in his bed feeling better than ever. It was truly an amazing feat, and he would be feeling even more excited if it weren't for the fact that he had been under strict orders not to move for the last week. Therefore, he has spent the last week sitting in bed eating, sleeping, and going over 7 years' worth of memories. It seems that he didn't just take over Julius's body. It was more accurate to say that their souls somehow combined. There wasn't a separation between identities. Nonetheless, because Julius was only around 7 years old, the memories and weight of his soul were slightly lower than Julian's. This is why he suspected his personality hadn't changed that much from his previous life. He also still had many questions regarding the events that brought him here, like whether that light show was the reason why he arrived in this world or what else might have happened to his world during that anomaly. He couldn't believe that something had only happened to him, but he didn't have enough information to answer his questions. But learning and understanding magic would probably be a good start. Unfortunately, there seemed to be an issue. Magic was not easy to learn. After a week of trying everything his brain could think of, he ended up back where he started. From visualizing to chanting, he made no progress. Although he would be damned if he didn't stop trying, it was magic for heaven's sake. He and every kid always dreamed about the day they acquired magic. Now, it was an actual reality for him, and he would be an idiot if he didn't put everything into learning it. He would not allow this chance to pass him by without giving it his all. He made a pact with himself to commit to learning magic. Even if it was extremely difficult, he wouldn't give up. So, he tried. For years, he followed the same routine every day. Wake up, try to use the mana around him, fail, eat, try again, fail, and sleep, only to repeat it again in the morning. He also went to go to see Edwin once a week. Edwin was a scary middle-aged gentleman for his educational lessons. He wasn't able to access any real knowledge from the library. He was allowed to read stories or history, but all techniques and guides were kept heavily restricted. Julius was thankful he retained his memories because learning another language would have been annoying and hard to explain to everyone. Following his lessons, he would spend the rest of his time reading whatever piece of literature he got his hands on or trying another method to use mana. In 3 years, he tried many techniques he thought of or found in stories. But nothing seemed to click for him. It was, to say the least, frustrating. But he never gave up. His latest attempt was to blindfold himself as he went around the estate. He got this idea because he believed that by depriving himself of his other senses, he could concentrate on his mana-sensing one. He would aimlessly walk around for hours, bumping into things at random, until he got used to it. Despite going through with it for almost a year, Julius didn't accomplish his goal. But he was adamant he was on the right track. Being able to perceive mana was an obvious condition to use it. Thankfully, since he was still considered a child who hadn't been baptized, most adults thought his odd behavior was simply that of a quirky child. Julius didn't think anyone really knew why, and those who did didn't believe him when he explained it to them. It was because they only saw him as a young child. That's how it worked in both worlds. Adults rarely ever take children seriously. But it certainly helped him in this case. He was now able to practice with complete freedom and without distractions. Therefore, he embraced the facade of a slightly smart yet eccentric child without a second thought. He kept that up for a long time, and although he didn't get a grasp on mana, he managed to enhance his other natural senses. He swore his hearing was magnified by a significant amount. He also became much more sensitive to tastes and smells. Another interesting development was that he was developing a sort of sixth sense. He would be able to tell where people were standing, or sidestep if he was about to run into them. It also became very hard for others to sneak up on him. And interestingly became more sensitive the more often he did it. Making a decision, he set aside his focus on finding a way to use mana for a while and decided to explore this possible ability a little more, focusing everything he had on developing it. As a result, he started pushing the limits of this ability. How detailed can he perceive something? How far does it extend? Is it only restricted to people, or can he sense objects? Those were the questions he wanted to find out. So he spent hours every day experimenting with this new power. Using his stubbornness as a sledgehammer, hoping to break through the invisible wall he felt was just beyond reach. So, he cranked up the intensity. Instead of depriving himself of just his sight, he stuffed pieces of clay in his ears and nostrils. Now, he could not see, hear, or smell. He wanted his entire focus to be on this supernatural ability. He also decided he needed to add some complexity to his actions. Rather than meditating on a bench or grass, he wanted to add stress to his training, hoping that it would act as a catalyst for improvement. Therefore, he exercised around the estate and swung a wooden staff he made at a gathering of trees and other targets, pretending they were enemies. It took a while for the results to show. But they slowly did. Now Julius was able to run around without ramming into trees or walls. He also hit most of his intended targets without missing. It was unbelievable for someone who had previously come from a world without magic. There were times when Julius would try random things, like guessing how many petals a flower has or how many coins are in a purse without looking. Julius also liked a game where he would grab a random rock and throw it while tracking its trajectory. That was a much harder endeavor. Perceiving a small inorganic object while it was moving was a challenge. But Julius noticed how challenging himself with games like these was improving his ability. Plus, it was just fun for him. It didn't feel like training because he was enjoying himself so much. Therefore, he got into the habit of making up random games that would force him to use this perception ability in more creative and challenging ways. It was during this time that Julius experienced explosive growth. Julius's dedication had proven its worth. His perception ability had grown to the point that he didn't need the blindfold and aids anymore. One morning, he woke up and realized he had been activating it instinctively. It was as if it were just suddenly there. Like another sense, he felt extremely validated for all his efforts. However, it seemed that using it alongside his other senses for very long was not yet possible. He believed the amount of information that his brain had to process was probably too much for him to handle. But he noticed that, With practice, using it with his other senses, he increased the time he could keep it up. In the meantime, he removed his ear and nose plugs to slowly introduce more stimulus at once so his brain could get used to it. Regretfully, now that Julius was almost 12, his antics were becoming less of an adorable quirk and more like he was just a weirdo. He observed that the other workers in his part of the estate started giving him strange looks from time to time. He hadn't quite learned how to eavesdrop on people's conversations with his perception ability yet. His ears were still unnaturally sharp, and he ended up hearing many of the workers talking about him behind his back. Nevertheless, Julius sucked it up and ignored them, continuing with his training. It wasn't like anything they were saying would get him to stop. Not after he had improved so much. In the end, he really didn't care what the others said or thought because he was having so much fun. He might not have actually learned to manipulate mana yet, but this ability to perceive in every direction is, in some way, more magical to him than throwing a fireball. Chapter 3, Strange Child. Edwin Pav. Edwin was enjoying his morning tea while reading an interesting report about the recent developments in the Kingdom of Corvus. Corvus was one of the Luminous Empire's largest trade partners. Situated on the Empire's western border, Corvus was having issues with its northern neighbor. According to the report, the Alliance of Morning Sun had elected a new leader. The country's previous prime was more interested in cultivating beneficial trade agreements with other countries. However, this new prime, Hallam Andaraz, had a different plan. Andaraz completely voided many of its prior contracts and planned to renegotiate its terms with Corvus. This obviously angered many in Corvus, who, in retribution, decided to restrict shipments intended for other countries. These tensions between the two countries and the various mercantile guilds and businesses have drastically raised prices and caused civil unrest in both regions. Luckily for House Hyperius, it's situated in the eastern region of the Luminous Empire, very far away from the potential conflict, Edwin noted. Edwin's attention was brought to the door that had just opened. Walking through was young Julius, still wearing a black cloth over his face. Edwin was well aware of the young child's strange hobbies. Everyone in the estate, even those who never met him, had heard of his peculiarities. But typically, Julius took his lessons seriously, which meant that he usually took off the get-up before the lesson started. He is by far one of the strangest children I have met. Remarkably intelligent in many areas of study, but he can be completely lacking when it comes to others, Edwin remarked to himself. The young scion of House Hyperius has been the subject of much gossip around the estate these past years. People took notice that the young child spent most of his days roaming and playing around the estate, doing weird things by himself. At first, when Julius decided to wear a blindfold, people thought it was cute. They thought he was just pretending to be a character out of a story. However, as years went by and he started to jam pieces of clay up his nose, people began to question the sanity of the young Hyperius. Edwin could not understand why Julius was so insistent, playing around like this. Edwin had discussed it in passing many times, but to no avail. Even now, Edwin was watching Julius as he retrieved his lesson materials. He was still blindfolded, taking his sweet time. Edwin knew Julius was doing it on purpose, in retribution for the times Edwin had done it himself. Exasperated, Edwin reached over to try to remove the stupid things. But surprisingly, Julius neatly swayed out of the way. Edwin had always had a suspicion that there was something more to the blindfold than at first glance. Julius was able to navigate his way around the estate quite well for someone unable to see, but Edwin had always thought that the blindfold was sheer enough that Julius could still see through it. Not to mention that Edwin actually tried to be quick about it. For an Untier to be able to dodge him when he was somewhat trying was embarrassing. He was a tier 4 who largely focused on speed. Besides, Julius wasn't even looking at him. I wonder. Deciding to do a little test, he used a bit of mana and wrapped it around a little sugar cube from the table and launched it at the back of Julius's head. Julius Pav. Julius was purposefully taking his time unloading his bag and setting up his stuff for the lesson. He learned this from Edwin himself. It was a tactic Edwin used to annoy him, and he found it quite effective when used on others. Whenever Julius had a question about skills or anything to do with what tiers were, Edwin would pretend to ignore him while slowly sipping his tea. Therefore, he made it his mission to be as petty as he could get away with. Nothing too drastic. The old man was still very intimidating, and Julius suspected Edwin was at least tier 3 or 4. Julius still had his blindfold on, and he could feel Edwin shifting in annoyance behind him. "Huh, doesn't feel so good when someone else ignores you, huh, old man?" Edwin didn't actually look old. He had the appearance of a fit 30-year-old man with medium-length black hair that curled at the tips. He had dark eyes and sharp facial features that made him look quite strict. But he also had a poise about him that exuded confidence. Suddenly, he felt Edwin tense and quickly reach out to Julius's head. Julius, who had learned to react very quickly to sudden perceptions thanks to his training, instinctually shifted his head to the side. Playing the ignorant, Julius pretended like he didn't even notice Edwin's actions. However, he soon felt something rise behind him. It was small, barely the size of a pebble, but it was oddly square, like a cube. How is it floating? I don't feel Edwin moving at all, but is he using mana to float it? I also feel something else, like there's swirling air around the object. Is this mana manipu? Without warning, the cube-like object was shot toward him with alarming force. Julius only managed to tilt his head a few degrees, and it still nicked him across the back of the head. A stinging pain erupted from where he was hit, and dropping his axe took off his blindfold to confront the crazy old man. "OWW, what was that for?" shouted at Edwin. "It's rude to ignore others, Julius," Edwin calmly responded. "I would argue that throwing things at others is more rude," Julius argued. Edwin just stared at Julius. It wasn't long, but it was enough to feel uncomfortable. Finally, Edwin chose to ask a question. "How did you know?" "Know what?" Julius played dumb. Edwin pressed his lips together. "How did you know what I was doing, even though you were not looking in my direction?" "I am pretty sure I have told you before. Haven't I?" "No, I am quite certain you have not. When I asked you last time, you said you were doing it because it was fun." Edwin said impatiently. "Well, it is fun. Doesn't mean there aren't other reasons." Julius replied. "So what are these other reasons?" Edwin stressed. Julius thought about answering. To be honest, while he hadn't kept what he was doing with his time a secret, he never gave a complete explanation about why he was doing it. Certainly not explaining his perception ability. He kind of liked keeping it a secret. However, it seemed no longer an option. "I originally started to wear a blindfold to get a sense of mana. I was hoping that by depriving myself of my other senses, I would be able to sense it more easily. I wasn't able to do that. However, a side effect is being able to sense my surroundings without relying on traditional senses." Julius explained. Edwin was surprised. For one, he noticed that Julius had spoken quite eloquently for a child who hadn't awakened yet. Secondly, noble houses have tried for many years to have their children sense mana before their baptism. However, they had never accomplished this with any reliability. Finally, an ability like this was quite outrageous. How does someone just gain the ability to sense everything around them by just wearing a blindfold? You're telling me that you are able to perceive your immediate surroundings because you wore a blindfold? Edwin asked for clarification. Not just wearing a blindfold, Julius added. Edwin just looked at Julius with a deadpan expression. "I also practiced," Julius said innocently. "Practice, he says. Julius, do you know how outrageous that sounds?" Edwin asked him. Julius shook his head. "There are many skills that improve perception. Most fighters end up getting one as a utility skill. Skills like mana sense or life detection. However, there are usually restrictions on what they can perceive. Mana sense has limitations. The major one is that it can only detect mana and not anything else. Life detection has the downsides of being able to sense living targets, not inorganic objects. Even the skill danger sense, which can detect practically anything as long as it presents a danger to the user's life, cannot sense small things or things outside of its scope. There are strengths and weaknesses to every skill. But your skill seems to be very versatile without much drawback," Edwin deeply explained. Julius had just learned more about skills and magic in that short rant than he had managed to find on his own for several years. Information about stuff like this was kept away from him. Furthermore, all his questions always seemed to come back to his baptism, which was only a few months away. Julius did not know how to respond to Edwin's statement. According to him, his ability, or rather, skill, was able to do too many things without a limit. Except for mana, he still hasn't quite figured that out. Wait a second, that last thing Edwin threw at me was different. Was that weird air around the cube? If so, does that not mean I can sense mana? If so, then all this time I have had the answers right in front of my face, but was too blind to see them. I gotta ask him, I have to know, Julius decided. Was that last thing you threw at me made up of mana? Julius asked with wide eyes. It wasn't made up of mana, but yes, I surrounded a cube of sugar with mana, Edwin said. This was amazing. So he was able to sense mana, which means there is a great chance that he would be able to find a way to use actual magic. Julius was still a little upset that he had been able to do this for who knows how long, but honestly, it was more of a relief. He had been trying for almost 5 years to learn how to do magic, and without any success, it was hard not to get pessimistic about it. If he didn't know with certainty that it existed, he wasn't sure if he would have been so stubborn. Nevertheless, Julius had finally done it. He wanted to run around with joy, shout from the rooftops. Maybe eat some cake. Yes, definitely cake is a celebration. I will ask one of the chefs to make one. This is a momentous day. He couldn't keep the massive smile off his face. Grinning like a maniac. All of a sudden, he felt something hard pelt him in the forehead. It broke him out of his daydreaming. He looked down and saw a sugar cube broken in half lying in his lap. Looking back up, he saw Edwin holding another sugar cube, preparing to throw it again. Do I have your attention again? Or is there something more important taking up your focus? Edwin asked with amusement. Sorry, I was just excited, Julius said, smiling. I didn't know my ability to detect mana until now. But now that I can start learning how to use mana. I think you are misunderstanding something, young master. Most people, unless they have that mana sense or similar skill, are not able to detect mana other than their own. Even then, the majority of people simply direct their mana into whatever skill they acquired. Edwin clarified to Julius. That was a revelation to Julius. He had always thought it was logical that people would have to be able to sense mana before they could use it. If he understood Edwin correctly, he was mistaken. He guessed that this was the main dilemma of practicing without access to knowledge and resources. He just didn't know enough to train effectively. Regardless, he had a feeling that things were about to take a big turn once his baptism came around. Chapter 4, The Chamber. In the months coming up to his baptism, Julius started to make some progress. He couldn't quite manipulate ambient mana, but he could sometimes push it around like one would try to move air by waving their arms really fast. Edwin became more involved than before. In the past, Edwin and Julius's relationship was at most considered professional. However, from that moment, Edwin started to take an interest in Julius's life. In contrast to previous years, Edwin would take the time to answer some of Julius's questions. He wouldn't answer everything, but compared to how it used to be, it was huge progress. As such, Edwin helped explain what a baptism entailed. He didn't go into too many details, but Julius was able to get a general understanding. Baptism was a ritual that everyone, from nobles to commoners, underwent. It was a process that infused a child with mana at the age of 12. The infusion of mana would start the process of developing one's core, allowing mana to be stored internally. This enabled children to start absorbing mana and try to consolidate it into a core. Once they concentrated all of their mana into a core, they would officially be considered a Tier 1. However, it was during the process of trying to develop a core that one would finally be able to have their own mana to practice with. That is the reason Julius had not been able to manipulate mana. Learning how to use your own mana can already be difficult, but trying to manipulate ambient mana as an untiered was on another level of difficulty. However, mana manipulation will be much easier to learn once he awakens and can use his own internal mana. A baptism was also used to determine someone's innate talent. Those with higher talents could be infused with more mana and develop their core much sooner than others. This was a good indication of how much mana you could handle at once. Soon, the days leading up to his baptism closed in. He noticed that everyone, except Edwin, started acting differently around him. Wondering why, he asked Edwin the next time he saw him. I am not really supposed to tell you this, but I feel like not telling you would just do more harm than good at this point, Edwin said in resignation. I need you to promise that nothing I say leaves this room. This is just between you and me, okay? Julius promised. Edwin hesitated for a moment before continuing. I bet you realized it already, but everyone has always stayed their distance from you, correct? Julius nodded in agreement. Seeing his response, Edwin went on. There is a reason for that. Your father does not have a good standing with the house. Although he is the patriarch's younger brother, many elders do not hold a favorable opinion of him. He has always been rash, arrogant, and quite careless, causing many issues over the years. This started many to talk about disowning him from the family. But one day he showed up with you. Said you were some child between him and some commoner. Unsurprisingly, the elders were not happy to hear that, and some wanted to throw both of you out of the house. Despite that, thanks to the patriarch's intervention, they allowed you and your father to remain, on the condition that it would be reevaluated after your baptism. That was a lot to take in. As Julius processed what he had just heard, he started to connect the dots. He was always curious why some servants of a noble house felt so comfortable acting casually around a young scion like himself, even going so far as to insult him. It also made sense why people like Gwen and some of the others he knew had been growing more and more distant over the years. So the reason why people were isolating themselves from me was that they thought I would fail. Julius wanted to confirm. Yes, considering the circumstances of your birth as well as your peculiar behavior, many do not have high hopes, Edwin confirmed. Did they think that his abnormality was an indicator that he was going to do poorly at his baptism? He thought many of the strange looks he had gotten over the years were because they thought of him as an odd duckling. However, looking back, he understood those looks were more pity than anything else. That was also probably why his family never interacted with him. If they thought there was a high chance of losing him anyway, why take the risk of getting close? So all those times when Gwen, Edwin, or someone else was dismissive or distant, they were probably just emotionally distancing themselves just in case something happened to him. It all started to make more sense. He was far too absorbed in his own training to notice these clues until it was almost too late. However, Julius still had a question for Edwin. What changed your mind? You did. Edwin simply said. How? He pressed. I had always thought you were an intelligent child, quick to pick up lessons, but you had very odd habits that were similar to what I have seen in other children who were mentally challenged. But seeing your skill completely changed my opinion. You don't get a skill like that unless you are extremely talented or hardworking. Edwin explained further. So you thought I was retarded? Hold up. Does everyone think that? Julius asked, afraid to hear the answer. Edwin didn't say anything for a few moments. Yes, he finally answered. Does this mean you now think I will do well enough during my baptism? Julius asked. You have nothing to worry about. Of that, I am absolutely certain. How do you know? Julius asked worryingly. Once you get to my age and tier, you just know things. Trust me, you are going to be fine. Edwin added confidently. Julius decided to trust him. It wouldn't matter if he worried about it anyway. With only a couple of days until he turned 12, there wasn't anything he could do. Once he realized that, a lot of his worries and stress went away. Julius took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had learned that sometimes, knowing something was beyond your control made stress less of a factor. And so the day of Julius's baptism arrived. Deviating from his usual routine, Gwen made sure he wore his best clothes and told him to follow her. She didn't mention where they were going or explain what was happening. After hearing what Edwin had to say to him, he could see that she had completely distanced herself from him. He wasn't going to lie, that kind of hurt his feelings. While they weren't close, she had been the person he had seen almost every day for most of his life. Gwen led him to a part of the mansion he was unfamiliar with, then opened a door that led further downwards. Of course, there is a creepy ritual chamber in the basement, Julian muttered under his breath. He didn't know if she heard him, but she continued on anyway. Once they reached the bottom, the entire floor opened up. It was the farthest thing away from a creepy chamber. Lamps with floating orbs of soft yellow light illuminated the chamber. There was intricate carving, embossed in gold, decorating every wall and pillar. In the center of the ceiling, there was a beautiful mural of the sky. A glowing sun was depicted at its center. shedding light across the entire mural and chamber. It felt oddly divine, like heavenly light flooding down on the mortal realm. It was gorgeous. It was completely unnecessary and probably cost way too much. But it was glorious. He was so distracted by the beauty that he completely missed the crowd surrounding a pedestal in the middle of the room. There was a surprising number of spectators, which made Julius slightly anxious. He only recognized a few faces. One was the patriarch, Lucas von Hyperius, who stood apart from the others and was closest to the pedestal. The patriarch was a very handsome man with wide shoulders, long blonde hair, and immaculate clothes. He was the quintessential image of a lord. However, it was the eyes that got Julius's attention. Golden yellow, glowing with an oppressive presence emanating from them, like he was looking down on everyone and everything. It reminded him of the sun depicted on the mural. It seemed like his father was forced to come as well because he was there too. However, his father didn't even bother looking up at him as he approached. But with a quick glance, Julius could tell he got his mother's looks. His father, just like his older brother, had long blonde hair tied in a bun, but a much sharper face and brown eyes. Julius, on the other hand, had soft black hair and a heart-shaped face, and dark brown eyes. He also spotted Edwin in the back, who gave him an encouraging nod. The patriarch, who was technically his uncle, suddenly spoke. "Come here, young Julius," Lucas commanded. Those eyes looked down on his much smaller frame with such intensity. There was nothing he could do but obey. His legs started to move on their own before he even knew it. Once he was close to the pedestal, he could see a round device implanted directly on top of it. It shone with a brilliant white light, sparkling with energy. "Are you aware of what a baptism is?" Lucas asked. Julius didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded his head. "Yes or no?" the Lucas demanded. "Yes," Julius managed to squeeze out. "Okay, I want you to put your hands on the awakening orb. Once I say begin, I want you to pull as much mana into yourself as possible. Don't stop until you can no longer take in any more. Am I clear?" "Crystal," he responded. "Excuse me," Lucas asked, narrowing his eyes. "I meant yes, I understand." Julius quickly amended. Giving Julius one last long look, he placed Julius's hands onto the orb. Begin. Chapter 5. The Baptism. The second the patriarch said to begin, Julius felt a warm sensation suffuse his entire body. However, just as quickly as it came, it slowly went away. The mana started to congregate towards the center of his chest. No, not towards his chest, deeper, more like it was heading directly into his soul. A part of himself that Julius never knew existed appeared within him. He could sense the mana from the orb start to collect within this chamber. The mana was like water vapor, slowly filling up the room. When the entire room was filled with this mist, it stopped filling on its own. The mana coming from the orb was slowing to a trickle. This is what Edwin meant by determining talent, Julius realized. So, it became the challenge of how much mana Julius could fit inside before stopping. Instead of just allowing the mana to fill up on its own, he began to try to shove in as much as he could into it. However, that stopped working too. He was letting more and more slip through his fingers, and most of it wasn't going to him but getting lost. Panicking slightly, he decided to change methods. What if he didn't shove the mana? What if he sucked it in, like air through his lungs? Visualizing what he imagined, he began to take deep breaths, trying to suck in as much mana with each breath. It started to fill up rapidly, and the pace increased noticeably. The room started to fill up with a thick fog rather than a fine mist. Julius began to understand that the more mana it held, the harder it was to bring in more. It didn't matter how much you wanted to continue. In the end, it became more about how much you can stuff into a limited space. With that being said, Julius had a random thought. He knew from his previous memories that condensed mist was just water. Therefore, it should be theoretically possible to fill it up until it is all liquid. He was curious what his core would look like if he accumulated as much mana as he could within himself. Goal in mind, he renewed his focus and tried to condense all the mana even denser, using the momentum of what he was taking in to compress what mana he already had into one side of the room. For a moment, nothing happened. It looked like he was just exerting himself unnecessarily. For a second, he felt a little give. It was a sign that it was possible. However, the rate at which he was bringing in new mana was slowing down. It became similar to breathing through a thin straw. No matter how hard he pulled in, there was a hard limit. But what if he didn't try to breathe it in? Why would he try to suck it in when he could pull it? Julius thought about what he could adjust, and after a moment, he realized. Just like the vortex of a whirlpool, he would rip mana and pull it into himself, constantly gaining more and more momentum. Not stopping until he was entirely filled to the brim. Image in mind, Julius started to spin the mana, mimicking a vortex. It was extremely difficult. On top of trying to continue to compress his mana into liquid form, his brain was on fire, and his soul felt like it was being wrung like a dish towel. However, it started to work. Mana now started to flood into him, wave after wave crashing against the mana already inside, making condensing it even easier. Once the vortex was spinning at a ridiculous speed, he didn't even need to focus on it anymore. It was sustaining itself without much input from him. Unfortunately, he started to run into a different problem. The walls of the room started to show signs of wear, and small hairline cracks appeared. Understanding that the walls containing his mana could not endure the pressure he was generating by compressing it, he started to enforce the walls themselves. He imagined his entire will infusing into the walls, smothering the mana inside, not allowing even a drop to get out. Eventually, he noticed a pool of mana, a small pool of liquid mana in the center of the room, radiating a sense of power that was incomparable to its prior form. However, Julius was at his limit. Hell, he was way beyond his limits. Only sheer stubbornness kept him going. He didn't even try to focus on anything other than keeping it contained. When Julius came to this world, he was given a chance, and he would not take it for granted. He had promised himself that he would never give up. He remembered what it felt like to give up, to fall to his death, to be okay with dying without a fight. Not again. He would fight for every inch, every second. He would fight. To that end, Julius didn't let up, not even as his soul was screaming in pain and his mind was in complete delusion. However, not even he could keep it up forever, and the comforts of darkness soon welcomed him. Lucas von Hyperius was speechless. His nephew, Julius, was an unexpected addition to his family. When his youngest brother came home bearing a baby boy in his arms, he didn't know what to think. The others thought it was well beyond the point of return for his brother. Lucas didn't necessarily disagree with them either. He loved his brother. Gregor was his youngest sibling and held a special place in his heart. With that said, Lucas knew he was irrational when it came to his brother. Gregor was given every chance to show the family he had changed for the better, but he failed to prove it over and over. Despite that, he continued to act like an arrogant fool, flaunting his status at every turn. He had no sense of responsibility. Instead, he spent his time out drinking and whoring around. It was an embarrassment as a member of a marquee house. It was only by Lucas's word that he had managed to stay attached to the house. However, when Lucas saw his brother bring home a child of his own, he thought it might be a sign that he would change. Except it didn't. Gregor remained a boastful, conceited, self-important noble. Naturally, Lucas was curious about the circumstances of Julius's birth. Thus, he investigated what had happened. Lucas wasn't stupid. He knew that Gregor probably had dozens of spawns running around the empire. He just didn't know what made him decide to bring Julius home instead. According to everything Lucas had managed to find out, the mother was just some commoner who had caught his brother's eye. However, with her passing, she requested that Gregor take care of their son. Lucas was surprised Gregor actually followed through, expecting him to drop the child off at some orphanage and forget about him. When Gregor brought young Julius back to the estate, many of the elders wanted to expel him immediately. Elder Samuel, who had a particular dislike for Gregor, was especially adamant. Fortunately for his brother and his child, Lucas managed to convince the others to allow them to remain in the family. However, Samuel put a stipulation in place, agreeing that they could, as long as they could reevaluate the situation once Julius's baptism had passed. Lucas was frustrated. He understood Samuel's dislike for his brother, but he disagreed with taking it out on Julius, who was, by all accounts, still his nephew and innocent. Lucas didn't believe in punishing a child for his father's crimes, but the agreement was set nonetheless. Gregor had gotten worse over the years, and the decision about him had already been made. As the patriarch, he had prepared himself for what had to be done. As the years went by, Lucas always maintained an eye on Julius. Other than one freak accident that occurred when Julius was 7, he was a perfectly healthy young boy. Lucas found himself enjoying hearing about his young nephew's antics and unusual behaviors. It was often a highlight of his day when Edwin came in to give a recent report. However, in Edwin's opinion, he thought the boy had a developmental disorder. He backed it up by noting his antisocial behavior, above-average intelligence, obsessive habits, and overall odd behavior, which were all signs that it was true. While Lucas understood some of the truth behind Edwin's claims, he couldn't help but feel attached to Julius. Lucas wasn't happy keeping his distance from his nephew all these years. He had to maintain his neutrality to avoid angering other family members. Unlike many of the other spoiled rotten kids running around, Julius seemed like a kind young man who treated everyone around him with respect and consideration. However, kindness and patience did not necessarily relate to talent, and if he wasn't talented enough, he would be expelled from House Hyperius. As such, he had already decided that if the baptism didn't go well, he would find him a loving home fit with anything he would need for his entire life. That was the least Lucas could do for Julius after being absent for many years. That said, he did not expect the current situation at all. Edwin had previously mentioned that the boy had a good chance of failing to meet the requirements to be considered a natural talent. When Julius first started absorbing the mana inside the orb, it was slow but predictable. So when Lucas noticed the rate of mana being absorbed slowing down, he was ready to end the test. Despite that, against all expectations, he felt the rate increase dramatically. Before, it was like raindrops accumulating, but now it felt like a faucet rapidly filling up a bucket. At this rate, he believed Julius would pass the test. Lucas took a quick glance at Edwin standing in the crowd. Edwin wasn't surprised. No, he had a shit-eating grin all over his face. Lucas was confused. Why would Edwin say he didn't think Julius would pass, but now was not even mildly shocked at the outcome? He pulled his attention back to Julius. The flow of mana was still impressive. However, Lucas ascertained that he would be slowing down any second. Sure enough, a few moments later, mana started to slow down. This was already an amount that exceeded the general average, which meant that the others arguing for his expulsion would find it difficult to do so. I guess this means that. Lucas's thoughts were interrupted as he felt a massive surge of mana, dwarfing the previous amount, erupt from the pedestal. Just as he thought Julius was done, he once again figured out how to increase the rate of flow. Everyone present, except for Edwin, was in undisguised shock at this turn of events. Even Samuel had a sour look on his face. After several moments, the amount of mana being drained from the orb was enough to fill several average cores. However, he could sense a lot of it was being wasted, dissipating into the surroundings. Therefore, it was difficult to predict how much mana Julius was retaining. Regardless, he had already proven his talent enough. At this point, Lucas could see that Julius's face was screwed tight in pain and concentration. Grinding his teeth so hard, Lucas swore he heard some of them crack. After a bit of time, trickles of blood started to drip out of Julius's nose and eyes. Alarmed, Lucas was just about to put a stop to it. However, just as he was about to interrupt, Julius passed out, falling to the floor. The rapid flow of mana was slowly dwindling, and Lucas noticed that Edwin immediately went over to tend to Julius while the others took time to process what had just occurred. The entire crowd was quiet for what seemed like an eternity. Not a single person spoke, in shock at what happened. Finally, Abigail, one of his cousins who oversaw the day-to-day operations of the house, such as scheduling and maintenance, spoke up. What in the God's name just happened? Nobody answered her. They didn't know themselves. However, after a bit, it seemed like Samuel had something he wanted to say. It seemed like the child managed to drain mana out of the device with a surprising level of force. However, I found it odd that although the amount of mana being drained was massive, most of it was being wasted. If the child had indeed been successful in absorbing even a small amount of that mana, he would have easily formed his core several times over. Therefore, Since he is evidently still untiered, I believe we can explain this as just an anomaly. Maybe the device has malfunctioned in a way, releasing way too much mana for a child such as Julius to handle. The people around took time to digest this information. Everyone knew that Samuel was one of the only ones with an advanced mana sensing skill amongst them. Most of the people around the estate were not the most skilled users in the family, bottlenecking around Tier 3. Most of their remaining elites were off doing more important missions or tasks. But Samuel was a powerful Tier 5, with over a century of experience. Thus, his statement convinced many of them. In their view, what Samuel proposed was way more realistic than the option that a child just turned 12 could somehow manipulate such an incredible amount of mana. An amount that many of them could not do on their own. Lucas decided to speak up. I agree. It is possible that it was a malfunction, and most of the mana towards the end was unabsorbed. With that being said, that doesn't mean the child didn't absorb any of it. By my accounts, young Julius was able to absorb much more than what most are capable of during their baptism. He has very likely filled almost all of his core. This means that by all standards, he is a talent we cannot afford to lose. Do you disagree, Samuel? Lucas looked directly at Samuel. Samuel grimaced briefly, then nodded in agreement. He knew Lucas's assessment was accurate. While his opinion was biased, he couldn't ignore the facts. Samuel was extremely loyal to his house and wouldn't deprive it of a potential talent just out of spite. Now that people got their composure back, several questions were thrown around at once, while the person of their inquiry lay passed out on the floor. However, something surprised Lucas. He didn't know if Samuel had managed to catch it, but he had. Lucas couldn't quite tell what Julius was doing with the mana he absorbed. It was a weird technique similar to what you would do to condense your core, but it differed in some ways that made it very intriguing. He also didn't miss the fact that this interesting technique wasn't released even after Julius passed out. Chapter 6, Unexpected Turn. Julius found himself lying down on the cold stone floor of the chamber. His mind was hazy, and he was barely cognizant. With his eyes still closed, he could recognize Edwin beside him. To his surprise, could feel Edwin channeling mana into him, rejuvenating him, something he wouldn't have been able to sense before. Julius immediately realized it was nothing like what he did during his baptism. Whereas Julius's manipulation was a violent tantrum, Edwin's manipulation of mana was elegant and beautiful, likely refined over many years of practice. Now that he had been baptized, he could see what Edwin meant. Before, it was like feeling mana through several layers of clothes. Now those layers were off, and he basked in the feeling of mana all around him. Using his perception ability, he sent out a small pulse to get a bearing on his surroundings, wincing at the slight headache. He was still lying next to the pedestal, but the spectators were now discussing things with each other, talking animatedly. However, what caught his attention was the sound of a ding going off inside his head, and he felt something inside him. Focusing on it, a notification popped into his head. Would you like to learn the skill, Sixth Sense? Julius was completely taken aback. What was this? Nothing he had experienced in the world so far suggested something like this. Nevertheless, after thinking for a moment, his curiosity got the better of him and he mentally confirmed. Congratulations, skill, Sixth Sense acquired. However, that wasn't the end of the notifications. Would you like to learn the skill, Detect Life? He hesitantly confirmed it as well. Congratulations, skill, Detect Life acquired. Would you like to learn the skill, Awareness? Congratulations, skill, Awareness acquired. Synergy detected. Would you like to evolve Sixth Sense, Detect Life, and Awareness into a single skill? Notice. This will remove existing skills. Julius didn't know the consequences of doing so, so he wanted to wait. To his relief, the second he decided to wait, the message disappeared. However, in the back of his mind, he knew that if he wanted to, it could reappear anytime. Julius, full of so many questions, opened his eyes to look at Edwin. Edwin must have felt him shift because his eyes, which were focused on the others' discussions, turned and looked down at him. I know you have many questions. I didn't tell you because it is hard to explain unless you experience it for yourself. It is also why this ritual is so important. It not only awakens your mana, but it also opens you to the words of the world. And I suspect you have a few notifications due to your perception ability. However, do not make any decisions yet. I will explain everything once we leave here and are alone. Edwin whispered quietly into Julius's ear. For now, pretend to be unconscious. You don't have anything to worry about. There is no way they are going to expel you after this. Edwin's words calmed down Julius significantly. He was curious about why Edwin didn't want to let the others know he was awake, but he must have a reason, so Julius played along. Now that he was somewhat lucid, he could listen in on the conversation. Someone had just asked a question. Did the child truly not receive any training during these years, Patriarch? Because I find it difficult to see how a child his age was able to achieve such a result. Julius didn't see who asked that, but Edwin spoke up from Julius's side and answered. I can personally guarantee that neither I nor anyone else had taught Julius any techniques. There has been no violation of the conditions you and the others set. Every bit of his results is due to his own merit. Conditions. I didn't know there were conditions. Just how much do I not know about my own circumstances, or about this world? I have more questions now than when I first arrived. I can confirm with Edwin's, Julius has been isolated for these years without the possibility of learning outside what was available to him, Lucas added. Therefore, I recommend that we do not expel him. Rather, we should cultivate his talent so that he becomes a more valuable member of the family, not wasting his talent. Does everyone agree on that? Lucas proposed to others. Everyone's head nodded in agreement, and nobody offered any opposing opinion despite there being a few disgruntled expressions. That was easy. I thought there would be more pushback. If I were to guess, that was what they were discussing when I was asleep, Julius thought to himself. Unfortunately, his father decided to speak up at that moment. Well, now that has been settled, I will be on my way. I have some things I need to do, Gregor said while already quickly making his exit. Most of the people had forgotten that he was even there in the first place. Even Julius had completely forgotten that his father was present. He decided to take a quick peek around, and based on what reactions Julius could perceive from the others, it might have been better to stay quiet. An older man with gray hair spoke up. Gregor, I am afraid that while the child has been decided not to be removed from the house, I can't say that goes the same for you, the man said. What do you mean? You all agreed that he is a valuable asset to the house. Gregor boasted. It does not work that way. 12 years ago, we decided to extend the vote on whether to expel Julius and you. Meaning, that just because we decided that Julius can stay, does not mean that we have decided that you get to stay alongside him. The older man explained. You are not making any sense, Samuel. I am still his father. Gregor insisted. A father in name only. I would be surprised if you had even had a conversation with young Julius in the 12 years since he was born. Over the years, you have come back to the estate a handful of times, and during these times, I don't recall you ever visiting young Julius. This man, who was evidently named Samuel, scolded his father. The house's servants are closer to a father to the child than you have ever been. Now you dare try to use that relationship to justify remaining within this house. You have been a plague to this family's resources, reputation, and have been an overall pain in the ass to everyone here. You are a talentless wastrel who only fucks whores and drinks booze. The noble house Hyperius does not need leeches like you. Samuel viciously insulted Gregor. Julius, even as Gregor's son, didn't find any fault in what Samuel said. Sure, it was harsh, but considering his father's reputation, it was completely warranted. It wasn't like Julius had any positive feelings towards this man anyway. To Samuel's point, Julius had not spoken a word to his father in 12 long years. In his mind, Gregor wasn't even his father. He had a better relationship with the guy who baked him cakes. However, just because Julius didn't take offense to Samuel's words, it didn't mean his father liked hearing them. Gregor's fists balled up in anger. He looked like he wanted to do something about it. However, in the end, he didn't. Julius was curious about Samuel. While he might have been older, with a full head of gray hair, his physical appearance told another story. Samuel was still fit, with broad shoulders and biceps the size of Julius's torso. Julius quickly saw that Samuel was not like the others there. He had a similar presence to the patriarch. There was an intimidating aura emitting from his body like bloodlust, smothering those in its wake. Julius didn't know what tier or how powerful Gregor was, but he would bet every penny that he was much weaker than Samuel. Watching Gregor not say a word, Samuel continued. Today, we were supposed to decide what we were going to do with both of you. The house has kept tabs on your activities over the past 12 years. It has been quite enlightening to see what you have been doing. Julius's father's eyes widened, and you could see the cogs turning inside his head, looking for a way out. Gregor inevitably looked over at his brother, Lucas. If there was someone who could save him from this situation, it would be his brother. But the patriarch of the Hyperius family could only look at his younger brother in disappointment, shaking his head slowly. Samuel wasn't finished. What you might not know is that your fate had already been decided weeks ago. Everyone has received a detailed report of your doings over these past years. It was unanimous. Not even your brother, for all he loves you, could overlook some of your egregious errors. Firstly, you threatened the son of Baron Astraeus, one of our few trusted remaining allies. Secondly, you decided to borrow 200,000 under the house's name, and thirdly, you were caught blabbering about house secrets in a brothel for everyone around to hear. Do I go on? I have over 24 more offenses recorded. Desmond Astraeus was the one who started it. He has always been a self-righteous prick and you know it. Also, I needed the money, I had some important house business to settle. Gregor pleaded. And the brothel? Samuel asked. The brothel doesn't matter. Nobody is going to believe a whore. Gregor said dismissively. Samuel could be seen sighing visibly in disappointment. That brothel was owned by Duke Grayson. Gregor said, looking like he swallowed a rock. Oh, that was all he said. Yes, oh indeed. You should never have been privy to that information in the first place, and thanks to you, Duke Grayson and everyone allied with him also know now. House Hyperius has been trying to recover for a long time, but in one swoop, you have ruined years of work. Samuel said angrily. It was an honest mistake. I promise. It won't ever happen again, I swear. Gregor pleaded, looking at his brother. Lucas did not even look at Gregor. Resigned to his brother's fate. We did have to discuss what would happen to you, Gregor. After all, you have already proven that you are willing to betray house secrets. Therefore, we can't take the chance of you running off to another house and selling out more secrets. There is really only one option. Samuel explained. Julius, while lying on the floor, was speechless. He didn't believe things would have escalated this far. He knew his father had a bad reputation, but this. Gregor began to freak out and beg for forgiveness, unable to even coherently say anything. I am truly sorry that it has come to this, Gregor, Samuel said softly. I didn't wish it would end this way. Julius could barely watch as his father begged desperately. So, Julius glanced at Lucas to see how he was reacting. Lucas was staring coldly at Gregor, making it clear that he would not help his brother. It seemed that Lucas could no longer protect his brother. Seeing nobody come to his aid, Gregor tried to run for it. Unfortunately for him, Samuel was prepared and had already wrapped him in mana. Completely immobilizing him, Julius watched as Gregor was helpless to do anything. Unable to speak or move due to what Samuel had done to him, he stared around frantically, tears pouring out of his eyes. In Julius's opinion, the man's fate was unsurprising. Gregor was already a deplorable man and had now betrayed his family. He knew most noble families would do even worse if one Gregor were one of their own. Furthermore, Julius found it difficult to feel any sympathy or remorse for a man whom he didn't know, and what little he did know wasn't pleasant. Julius knew what it was like to lose his family. After he had lost his family and Gramps, he had cried for days on end. He still felt the pain from their deaths. However, now that he was about to watch his new father get executed, he didn't feel a thing. It made Julius question his own morality. Shouldn't I feel more upset? Failed father or not, he was still technically family. Breaking his silence and Julius out of his thoughts, the patriarch spoke. Gregor von Hyperius, as the patriarch of House Hyperius, I, Lucas von Hyperius, declare you a traitor to your house and therefore sentence you to death. Julius could feel an incredible amount of mana move. It made the amount of mana used during his baptism look pathetic in comparison. He could feel it congregating towards the patriarch. Then, in a split second, an aura of light appeared around his father's frozen body and erupted with golden light. There was no heat or explosion of energy. Just silence and an empty spot where Gregor had stood. Chapter 7, Training Begins. Afterward, Julius was in a bit of a daze. There was a lot to unpack. His father's death didn't have much impact on him as he would have thought, even after the shock of it. What had astounded Julius more was the casual ease with which the patriarch had vaporized his brother. It wasn't like in movies, a big explosion, no. The calm effortlessness was what surprised Julius. It was the first time Julius had seen someone who was powerful seriously use magic, and it was terrifying. In the days that followed his baptism, Edwin remained close by. It was unusual. Julius was used to seeing Edwin once a week for many years. However, recently he has been spending much more time with him. Julius enjoyed his company. As irritating as Edwin could be at times, he was a comforting presence to be around. He didn't speak or ask unnecessary questions about how Julius was feeling. He would just sit there sipping his tea while reading a book. They did end up discussing the prompt that showed up after his baptism. Amid all the drama, Julius almost completely forgot about the notifications he had received. He ended up going to Edwin to answer some of his questions. Skills are considered a blessing from the words of the world. It is the closest thing to a god that humanity knows of. Edwin described, "You will receive the opportunity to learn a skill through repeating an action over and over again. Skills are very important for many reasons. For example, lighting a fire would be more efficient mana-wise and faster to activate with a skill rather than manually. However, there is a limit to how many skills you can learn at one time. Humans can learn 10 skills before the capacity in their souls is reached. This means that it becomes incredibly important what skills you choose to learn. You will always have the choice to remove skills, but that is an extremely painful process. Once you told me about your ability, I already expected you to receive a notice about learning some sort of skill after your awakening. But what did you end up getting?" Edwin asked him. Julius considered not telling Edwin, but in the end, he needed information more than he needed to keep secrets. It was an opportunity to learn something important, and he couldn't afford to be tight-lipped about it. "I got offered 3 separate skills: Sixth Sense, Life Detection, and Awareness. I didn't know there was a limit to how many skills I have, but I learned all of them," Julius admitted. Edwin winced. All 3 of those skills are useful, but honestly, awareness is probably the best out of the 3. With time, you could learn to do the effects of Sixth Sense and Life Detection with some time and practice. Luckily, you have plenty of slots left. You will probably have to release them in time, but you can worry about that later. Julius almost forgot to mention the other notice he got. I also got a prompt telling me there was a synergy between the 3 skills and that I could combine them. I didn't say yes or no, but if I did, does this affect how many skills I can still hold? Edwin's eyes widened, and his lips curled into a grin. No, you can hold 9 more. Can you still pull up the notice? Julian nodded. Okay. I want you to read it to me word by word. Julius pulled it up again and repeated exactly what was said for Edwin. Synergy detected. Would you like to evolve Sixth Sense, Detect Life, and Awareness into a single skill? Notice. This will remove existing skills. You or something else, Julius. Combining synergistic skills is everyone's goal. Being able to combine skills into a single one is a massive advantage at the later tiers. Edwin said in disbelief. Really? Why is that? Julius asked. Edwin gave an example. Imagine a fight between 2 fighters in the same tier, but one of them has a few combined skills while the other doesn't. Who do you think will win? With the same experience, probably the one with the combined skills because he has effectively more skills than the other, Julian responded. Correct, but there is more to it. To evolve a skill, you must reach a certain threshold of understanding. Meaning, you can't just learn a couple of skills and combine them. You would need to practice them extensively and then understand how these skills interact and synergize at a fundamental level. It is not easy to achieve. So I should evolve them. Julius was sure this was a no-brainer, but he wanted to double-check. Yes, the sooner the better, Edwin told him. Now that Julius had a better understanding of skills, he mentally focused on the message and selected yes. Skill evolution commencing. Congratulations, skill, spatial perception, rare, acquired. It says, I gained the skill, spatial perception, but it says it is rare, Julius said. Skills typically start at level 1, and as you progress through use, you can evolve them down various paths. You could keep the same path and specialize, or combine skills with it, both have their advantages. This usually leads to a skill's improved rank. Most are common ranked, but it goes up from there. Next is uncommon, then rare, then epic. The fact that you already have a rare ranked skill is very impressive. Edwin patiently explained, but Julius spotted a slight frown on Edwin's face, which was quickly hidden. This was a familiar concept Julius had seen in video games. Which begged the question, why was it so familiar? Even more questions. So if I understand it correctly, unless you combine skills, the only way to rank up skills is by increasing their level. Julius asked. Level 10 is the minimum threshold one would need to get in order to qualify for a skill rank up. Usually ends up being higher in reality. Edwin said, what's the best way to level up? Julius was curious whether there was a method to increase the rate of skill leveling. After many centuries, nobles have found a method that works the best by far, Edwin said with a grin. Really? Julius had an excited expression on his face. He was already fantasizing about all the things he would be able to do with the techniques of a noble family. Practice, Edwin said. Sorry, Julius asked. Practice, Edwin repeated with a big smile. Shortly after his conversation with Edwin, the patriarch summoned him to his study. After Edwin had shut the door, Julius realized it was just him and the man who had casually erased his father several days prior. Not going to lie, it made Julius nervous. Nobody spoke for a while, it was just the two of them sitting in their respective chairs in silence. Until the patriarch finally decided to break it. I first want to apologize for never coming to see you. As the family head, I have a responsibility, and that responsibility made me unable to get close to you. Lucas explained. I hope this doesn't mean we can't become closer. I lost my younger sister in the monster flood years ago, and I never had children of my own. Edwin already explained some of the situation to me, Lord Hyperius. I don't hold much resentment towards you. I understand that my conditions could have been much worse. After all, I still had servants taking care of my needs. But I am curious about what will happen now, Julius said. Julius could see on Lucas's face that he was having a difficult time accepting Julius's ease in forgiving him. He probably thought it would be more difficult. First off, you can call me uncle when we are in private. As for what happens now, it is to begin your formal training. Because of your circumstances, you have never been given the same opportunity as the other sons and daughters of House Hyperius. The original plan was to put you with the other children and to catch you up. However, Edwin had another suggestion. He volunteered to be in charge of your training. Honestly, I was a bit surprised. In the many years I have known Edwin, he has never volunteered to train anybody. Lucas said, so I will be his first. Julius asked, yes, you will be. I am confident you won't find a better teacher. Edwin is one of the best fighters at Tier 4 you can find in the Valorbury region. Lucas explained. He placed in the top 50 in the Tier 3 Luminous tournament as a commoner. A feat very few have achieved. Tier 3 Luminous tournament. Julius hadn't heard anything about a tournament like this. Yes, it is a tournament held within the capital, Luminous, every year. Every academy across the empire is invited to participate in deciding who is strongest. Each school sends its best and brightest to compete. There are also other competitions for enchanting, smithing, alchemy, and other sections. But by far the most popular is the martial competition. You might even have the option to join this tournament in a few years. Julius wasn't expecting that. He had been so focused on his training that he had completely forgotten what he would have to do as a nobleborn. Most nobles are sent to academies once they turn 15 or sometimes earlier if they reach Tier 1 before that. This excited Julius. For years, he had been stuck in the estate, not allowed to leave. The idea of exploring a new world and attending a school to learn magic sounded fantastic. Having to deal with school drama again wasn't ideal, but it was worth it if it meant he could get some freedom. After that, the two of them just talked. Like any plans or goals Julius had, or stories they wanted to share. It was soon apparent that his uncle truly wanted to get to know him. Julius had to admit that while it was awkward at first, it was nice that he was finally building a relationship with his new family. He tried not to hold the fact that Lucas had ignored Julius for years against him. There was at least a decent reason for it. They also discussed what his future training would be like. According to his uncle, his main focus will be on condensing his core. On top of that, he would be doing physical training with Edwin every day, as well as some mana exercises. However, he was told he needed to limit how much mana he used. This was because, without a core, Julius wouldn't be able to regenerate mana on his own. He would have to absorb ambient mana and then use that to fuel his usage. However, that would also mean he would be taking mana away from his core, significantly increasing the time it would take to establish his core. The mana exercises he would be learning to use would center on his recycling whatever was left back into himself without wasting it. This is also the reason why most join a school or academy once they reach Tier 1. Otherwise, it was just a waste of time. However, Julius now had a goal. For a while, he had been stuck training his perception skill with no real way forward. Julius's first day of formal training arrived. He was told that Gwen would no longer be assigned to him, and Edwin would be taking up most of her duties on top of his training. Julius showed up at the training yard right after the sun rose. Edwin was already there waiting for him with his arms crossed. Edwin didn't even take the time to greet Julius. He just stared at him and said, "Start running." Julius had a bad feeling about what was to come, but still ran around the training yard anyway. "Faster!" Edwin yelled. Julius picked up his pace, but after a couple of minutes, he started to flag. His pace started to slow down, and Edwin did seem to appreciate that. Julius felt a painful zap go right into his back. That, on top of the exhaustion, caused him to trip over his feet and fall right onto his face, tearing up his hands and knees on the stone floor. "Where is all that bravado? Giving up already?" Edwin taunted him. "Not in a million years, and definitely not you, old fart. I know if I give up, you would hold it against me forever," Julius told himself. He crawled his way back to his feet and started back into a run. For what seemed like hours, Julius ran around the yard. The only thing that kept him going was sheer stubbornness and the fact that if he did stop, Edwin would zap him and then insult him while he was face down on the ground. Then would continue to zap him until he got back up. Julius was already aware that Edwin was a petty old bastard, but during training, he became a ruthless taskmaster. "Why are you stopping? Did your legs fall off, or are you just that pathetic? Stop breathing so hard, I can smell your nasty fumes from here." Edwin continually berated Julius. Julius knew that Edwin was trying to beat him up physically and mentally toughen him up. But just because Julius knew what Edwin was doing didn't mean he wasn't getting angry. With that being said, he could see why militaries back in his old world used methods like this. It was very effective. The fact that Edwin was able to use healing magic on Julius whenever he could not move anymore made the training even more brutal. Instead of getting a break to recover, he would be given a painful jolt of healing mana that would increase his recovery. Edwin claimed he wasn't very good at healing magic, and that was why it was slightly painful. But Julius knew he was full of shit. He had already felt Edwin's healing magic before, after his baptism. He was just doing it to hurt Julius and because it seemed like he enjoyed it. This went on until lunchtime, when he was given time to eat. After that, Julius sat down to meditate. The orb that was used to awaken him was only useful for children who had not accumulated any mana whatsoever. Once someone goes through their baptism, it falls to the individual to independently absorb mana. That was where it got hard. Julius had to meditate and enter a trance-like state, which was already hard enough as is, but Edwin decided to add an additional challenge on top of that. Julius was supposed to enter a trance while maintaining spatial perception. Edwin explained that any self-respecting practitioner should be able to cultivate his mana with distractions. This might have been easier for others, but with Julius's skill, it was practically impossible. Since spatial perception had to process an insane amount of information while active, meditating when Julius was using it was like trying to ignore a child who was simultaneously screaming and slapping his face. It didn't help that Edwin just stood by reading a book while occasionally throwing random things or zapping him. While Julius had no success in finding his inner peace, he was able to level up spatial perception quite nicely. Spatial perception has reached threshold. Spatial perception LVL1 to spatial perception LVL2. Spatial perception has reached threshold. Spatial perception LVL2 to spatial perception LVL3. Spatial perception has reached threshold. Spatial perception LVL3 to spatial perception LVL4. Edwin mentioned that, since he had prior experience with the skill, Julius would see a higher rate of leveling until he caught up. Afterward, it would slow down to normal. Regardless, it still felt nice to see the numbers go up. Chapter 8, Daily Grind. Once Julius finished up his meditation attempts and his perception training, he would eat dinner and start on his mana manipulation training. The current goal was just for him to learn mana manipulation. Julius had considered the idea that he should learn how to manipulate mana without the skill. Edwin quickly dissuaded him from the thought. Mana manipulation was too important a skill not to have. It was the one skill that everyone had at some point during their path. The advantages it gave were too enormous to ignore, and only an idiot would not gain the skill. Was it strange that Julius wanted to try it anyway? Edwin taught him mana manipulation techniques that had him pull a small amount of mana from himself and try various activities, such as writing his name in the air with it or making general shapes. All the while, trying not to waste a single bit of it. If he lost control for even a second, he would have to begin again. After several days of practicing for several hours every night, he finally got the prompt. Would you like to learn the skill mana manipulation? Congratulations, skill mana manipulation acquired. Edwin was right. The difference was substantial. It wasn't like spatial perception. Spatial perception didn't feel like it became more effective after he received a skill for it. The skill mainly lightened the mental load it had on him. However, in this case, Julius could feel the skill activating and assisting him in manipulating the mana. The best thing he could compare it to was the difference between playing a video game with aim assist on versus having it off. It was slight, and you still needed to do the majority of the work. But some of the smaller adjustments were taken care of thanks to the skill. It was an amazing skill. So obviously Julius decided to get rid of it. It was painful to remove a skill, but he finally managed after an hour of attempting. Would you like to remove the skill mana manipulation? Notice. This action will remove mana manipulation from your current skills. Mana manipulation has been removed from your current skills. Several months went by like this, and during this time, Julius had finally gotten into good enough shape for Edwin to decide to teach him how to fight. They started with unarmed combat, an important skill that many nobles didn't focus on. Julius didn't blame them for not wanting to. Getting hit sucked. One moment you think you're fine, then all of a sudden you overextend and take a fist to the face. Or sometimes you get tripped up and take a foot to the face. There are other times you are just too slow to react and take a spinning backhand to the face. What was Julius trying to get at? He got hit in the face a lot. However, the second he overprotected his face, Edwin would punish him and land a shot in his gut. For those who had never been hit in the liver, you feel like you just died. You forget how to breathe and how to stand on your 2 feet. For several hours a day, Julius would get folded like a lawn chair in the training yard. Some of the other members of the house who wanted to train in the mornings often watched them from the sidelines. It became a game to bet and see how long Julius could last against Edwin. Julius knew in his head that he was improving rapidly. His tolerance for abuse had certainly gotten better. The problem was that whenever Edwin thought he had as well, he would raise his strength and start hitting harder and faster. So, although Julius was incomparable to himself before, he somehow continued to get even harder beatings. Edwin was truly a sadistic teacher. He would make him run around until he was ragged. Heal him. Beat him senseless. Heal him. Beat him some more. Heal him. It was an endless cycle of beatdowns. With that being said, Julius had to admit that Edwin's training paid off. He looked at the most recent notice he got after the last spar. Unarmed combat has reached threshold. Unarmed combat LVL3 to unarmed combat LVL4. There was something undeniably satisfying about seeing his progress quantitatively. Julius was getting a bit worried for himself. At the beginning of these sessions, he would actively avoid getting hurt. Now, he didn't care about getting beaten up. He became desensitized to the pain. All that mattered to him was managing to land a hit on Edwin. Not that it ever happened, of course. The only hits Julius ever got in on Edwin were the ones that Edwin allowed him to. Edwin would purposefully leave an opening for Julius to exploit, but Julius had not managed to catch Edwin off guard on his own. Julius found himself eating lunch with his uncle, Lucas. This has become a daily occurrence for both of them. While both he and his uncle had busy schedules, they decided to make time for lunch and dinner together every day, if possible. Edwin also ended up joining them, who took a brief respite from his trainer mindset and just relaxed with them. During this time, Julius had learned many things about each of them. He learned stories about how the two of them met while traveling. They met while doing an extermination mission that the Adventurer Guild had posted. His uncle was still a Tier 4 at the time, and Edwin was with a separate group that was all Tier 3s. The extermination was for a colony of stone-gorging ants, a threat that could vary from Tier 2 all the way to Tier 5. It was important to deal with any colonies before they grew to such dangers. Otherwise, the local environment and nearby towns would be in danger. Luckily for them, scouting reports put the ants at around Tier 3 or, at most, low Tier 4. As such, his uncle was one of the leaders of the extermination party, where he noticed Edwin's talents. There weren't many Shadow Affinity users in the Empire, but their usefulness was unanimously agreed upon. Not many were born with the affinity, and those that were usually belonged to Clan Genshin. Clan Genshin did not hold any noble title, but they were known for their strength and abundance of Shadow Affinity users. They were elite assassins, scouts, infiltrators, and typically those who ventured into dangerous places alone. The clan recruited many commoners who found out they had the affinity. It was known that Shadow was an extremely difficult affinity to train on your own. As such, most chose to join Clan Genshin. Edwin was different. He had learned his entire path practically on his own and had garnered a reputation for himself already. Coming in the top 50 of the Luminous tournament was quite an achievement, and, on top of his affinity, it led to many offers from powerful groups before and after his graduation. However, Edwin didn't choose any of them. Instead, he decided to become an adventurer with 3 of his friends. As fate would have it, when Lucas and Edwin met, 2 of his party members were expecting a baby and planning to settle down. Which meant their party would be disbanded. Therefore, Lucas made Edwin a very generous offer to come and work for House Hyperius. An offer that Edwin clearly accepted. After lunch, Julius started on the most challenging part of his day. While he had been able to enter into a trance on occasion, he couldn't do it consistently or for very long. With spatial perception active, it had taken him months to be able to do this much. On the bright side, using his skill in this way had done wonders for its progress. Edwin also told Julius of a way to see his skill levels. Julius had taken to calling it his status. He mentally envisioned what he wanted to know, and it popped up in his mind. Name: Julius von Hyperius. Tier: 0. Skills: Spatial Perception LVL9 Rare. Unarmed Combat LVL4. It wasn't too helpful now, but Julius expected that once he filled out his skills a bit more, he would be thankful for its existence. For the past few months, Julius had been trying to meditate and enter a trance to begin absorbing mana and condensing his core. The few times he succeeded, he saw a space around a quarter filled with liquid, with the rest occupied by a dense fog. It gradually decreased as his attempts to manipulate mana failed, and eventually some of it dissipated. However, it wasn't too much, at least by Julius's estimations. While some of the fog had dispersed a little, the liquid remained untouched. This led him to believe that the amount concentrated within the liquid was vastly superior to the other mana, both in quantity and quality. Julius had been trying something different for the past week or so. Before, he had been attempting to meditate by clearing his thoughts and ignoring stimuli. However, he had an idea. Instead of clearing his thoughts, he wanted to find a balance. Just like a state he sometimes got into when he practiced mana manipulation, he would try the same for this. Julius sat down and started to focus. Not on his inner core, but outwards. He used his perception to focus on everything around him. Every pebble, every drop of water, every crack in the stone, he focused on everything. Once he reached a state of total concentration, he took a deep breath, imagining the vortex from his baptism, and mana surged into him. To his surprise, it worked, which snapped him out of his trance. But Julius understood something now. For Edwin and others, clearing their mind was easier than. For Julius, he almost needed to do the opposite. He needed to fill his mind with so much that there wasn't space for distracting thoughts. In that revelation, Julius heard a ding. Would you like to learn the skill focus? Yes. Congratulations, skill focus acquired. Julius immediately attempted to meditate again. To his shock, it baffled him how hard he had found it just mere minutes ago. Now it was like second nature. Focus allowed him to reach this state without struggling, and he could still think while in his trance. He should have gained a skill like this much earlier. He was going to have to remember to ask Edwin about this skill later and how common it was. For the first time since his baptism, he was able to cultivate mana. He would now be able to condense his core and reach Tier 1. This would allow him to practice more mana-intensive techniques without worrying about recycling it. Now that Julius had cultivated, he sat down and got to work. He maintained the same method he used during his baptism, the only difference being that he didn't have an orb that directly provided him with mana. From now on, he would need to learn to absorb mana from the environment, which was much slower and tedious. But after an hour of meditating, he received another notice. Focus has reached threshold. Focus LVL1 to Focus LVL2. The past several months had been a difficult grind, but now Julius felt it was worth it. This feeling was what motivated Julius to train harder. The feeling of improvement. Chapter 9. Seeing Results. Edwin Pav. Edwin had volunteered to train Julius. The thought of training someone had never occurred to Edwin before, but for some reason, he wanted to with Julius. When he saw Julius training his spatial perception, he knew there was something special. The fact that a child could acquire a rare skill like that was unfathomable to Edwin. Most people went their entire lives without earning a rare skill, not to mention a skill that Edwin suspected was on the higher end of rare. Edwin could recognize a fellow training maniac when he saw one. At 13 years old, Julius was unlike any other child his age. Most of his peers were content running around playing games with their friends, but Julius was different. Edwin had begun Julius's training over a year ago and was surprised at how dedicated Julius was. Many would see Julius as a child being pushed too hard by Edwin, and was only doing this much because he was being pressured. However, Edwin realized that Julius really, and he meant really, loved it. It was alarming how much Julius enjoyed getting beaten up and doing boring mana exercises for countless hours every day. Even Edwin, who was known as a training junkie in his younger days, wasn't this obsessed. Edwin knew that Julius's work ethic would bring him far. He knew exactly what hard work could do for advancement. The only things that had stunted Edwin's advancement were his substandard foundation and lack of knowledge. He was a hard worker, but he didn't know enough about his shadow affinity when he tiered up. Thus, some imperfections limited his ability to reach Tier 5. Combat ability-wise, he was the cream of the crop of Tier 4, but until he cleaned up his path, he would forever remain a Tier 4. That was one of the main reasons he accepted Lucas's offer all those years ago. He already knew his foundation would be what prevented him from advancing further. And Lucas had offered him the resources to fix it. Tier 5 was a barrier that separated the good from the great. Most talented individuals could reach Tier 4 with time, as long as they survived. However, Edwin believed what separated the Tier 5s from the Tier 4s was their ability to push themselves. Unless one goes beyond their limits, they won't ever become Tier 5. That was why Edwin chose to train Julius. He truly believed Julius had what it took to cross this barrier. He certainly had the work ethic. But mostly, Julius enjoyed training. It surprised Edwin just how fast Julius adapted to his training. When they first started sparring, Julius was timid and unconfident in his approach. Now, Julius fought like a demon. Aggressive and decisive were the best descriptors Edwin could think of. Julius's style revolved around taking 2 hits for every one he gave. He didn't mind taking a knee or 2 in the stomach if it meant he got to punch you in the face in return. Normally, Edwin would discourage such an aggressive fighting style. His own style was more about countering and avoiding direct conflicts. Julius was the opposite. He used every angle and every potential leverage point he could to gain an advantage over his opponent. It was gritty and violent. The young fighter also quickly learned to use his fighting style's weakness as a weapon. Edwin began to notice that Julius would wait for Edwin to capitalize on his aggression and use that slight opening to strike. Julius's instincts when it came to fighting were honestly frightening. But Edwin was certain those instincts would save his life many times over the years. Which was the whole point of this training. Julius Pav. Julius swept his leg out towards Edwin's left knee, trying to smash his kneecap. When it missed, he closed in on Edwin, not letting him have a chance to retaliate. He threw a flurry of punches, looking for any openings. He took a couple of shots but maintained his aggression. He couldn't allow Edwin to sit back and pick him apart. There. Edwin hadn't quite predicted his feint, and Julius launched a kick right at Edwin's temple. Unfortunately, Edwin was quick and managed to step into Julius's kick and grab him around the thigh. He then proceeded to smash his fist into Julius's torso and simultaneously sweep out his other leg from underneath, then tossed him like a sack of potatoes across the training yard. Edwin calmly stepped back, and Julius stayed on the floor, soaked in sweat and sore all over. Focus has reached threshold. Focus LVL6 to Focus LVL7. Unarmed combat has reached threshold. Unarmed combat LVL8 to Unarmed combat LVL9. A double level up was rare, but more than welcome at this point. He had now reached the bottleneck stage in unarmed combat, which Edwin mentioned was a skill that usually upgraded at level 10. Each rank up reset a skill's level to 0, but it also meant the next level requirement would be 5 levels higher. For example, when unarmed combat reached level 10, he would receive an option to evolve the skill. Once he did, it would become an uncommon skill at level 0. If he wanted to rank it up to rare, he would have to get it to level 15, and so on. Name: Julius von Hyperius. Tier: 0. Skills: Spatial Perception LVL16 Rare. Unarmed Combat LVL9. Focus LVL7. His spatial perception skill had grown to level 15 before he finally felt its accelerated growth slow down. But it proved how much work he had put into the skill beforehand. He was going to miss the rapid level ups. It seemed the higher the rank and level were, the more difficult it became to level up a skill. The single level from 15 to 16 took over a month to achieve. However, the effects increased in proportion to the skill's rank and level, too. Therefore, the one level up provided a significant boost to how far he could extend it and how long he was able to keep it active. He would estimate that he could now perceive 20% farther than before and could maintain the skill up to 10 to 30% longer, depending on circumstances. Julius was also very close to condensing his core. He probably had only a few days left before his preparations were complete. Which meant Tier 1 was right around the corner. Not having a core really put a limit on how much mana he could use without regressing his progress. It also made it more difficult to gain more skills. Most active skills require some usage of mana to operate. He has been lucky in acquiring 2 active skills, Spatial Perception and Focus, which didn't require any mana, just mental energy. He already had an idea for a skill once he condensed his core. It would address many of his weaknesses in close combat. Julius had a lot on his mind as he walked to the kitchen. Although his schedule was already extremely packed, he couldn't keep up just fighting and training all day. He needed something to do that would let him relax and chill out. A hobby or project that didn't have anything to do with getting better. The first thing he thought of was cooking. He and his Gramps would spend a lot of time cooking together, and he missed the simple activity of just making food. Therefore, Julius had begun cooking meals for Edwin, his uncle, and himself, trying to do it at least once a day. It was oddly relaxing. Julius was almost 14 years old, and for the majority of the past 2 years, he had not done anything except for sparring, meditating, and exercising his mana control. Through cooking, he reminded himself that there was more to life than getting stronger. Tonight, he was planning to make something for the 3 of them. He didn't know what he wanted to make exactly, but he was thinking something a little lighter. It has been a hot summer this year, and maybe some fresh fish would be nice. Luckily, it seemed like much of the cuisine in this world was similar to what existed in his old one. There were still the same proteins like beef, pork, poultry, and fish, just with a lot more variations. For tonight, He wanted to see what was already available in the pantry before he decided. This world didn't have technology on the level of his previous one, but they still had some impressive inventions in their own right. Instead of refrigerators, they had coolers the size of a small chest, enchanted with spatial expansion magic, that could hold enough food to fill a small room. They were also enchanted with magic that preserved food for much longer durations than was natural. Additionally, their water system was amazing. They didn't need to pipe water in from anywhere. As long as you had a water affinity stone or crystal and had mana to supply it with, you can have clean water at any time. This world might not have the internet, but it certainly has things that many in his old world would dream of. Julius finally made it to the kitchen and said hello to the workers who were still around. There usually weren't many people in this particular kitchen because this wing of the mansion only housed a few members. The rest of the members lived on the other side of the mansion, which is why Julius rarely saw anyone else besides the workers. This also meant that he had most of the kitchen to himself, which was also very nice. Julius checked the pantry for what was still left over from the day. He spotted several portions of white fish and a healthy selection of vegetables. Grabbing what he needed, he began preparing dinner. Julius decided to make a quick marinade for the fish. He used some citrus-like fruit that reminded him of a lemon. It was yellow but about the size of a small melon. There were also these flower petals that tasted similar to chili but had a weirdly sweet component as well. He also added some herbs from pots on the windowsill. As Julius let the fish marinate for a little bit, he started on the rice. It was surprising to find rice in this world, but it was also much more delicious than typical rice. It was even more fluffy and had an innate richness that paired well with almost everything. Afterward, he also prepped the vegetable medley. He was going to grill them with the fish. There was something that he never expected. Cooking with an open fire made by mana could influence the flavor. It was similar to how charcoal imparts a delicious smoky element, but on another level. The best way to describe it was magical. It literally exploded with flavor on his palate. As such, it seemed that much of the food made in this world was cooked over an open flame. Julius couldn't blame them. Even vegetables, depending on the variety, could end up tasting sweet, spicy, or citrusy just from the mana flame. Julius removed the fish from the marinade and placed it on the grill, alongside the vegetables. The fish hit the fire with a satisfying sizzle. The smell of citrus and chilies emanated from the fire, making his mouth water. Julius smiled. These moments reminded him of simpler days. Days when he and his Gramps would be camping out in the middle of the wilderness, catching fish and grilling them on an open campfire. He missed those moments, and as time passed, he cherished them more. Julius was lying in bed, just playing around with his mana. He learned that mana manipulation was like a muscle in many ways. Only by constantly using and stressing it could it become stronger. It also required a lot of creativity to find entertaining ways to practice. Otherwise, it would be too boring to repeat the same exercises over and over. Right now, Julius was trying to replicate one of Edwin's tricks. Edwin had managed to wrap his mana around several objects at one time and then simultaneously move them in complete synchrony. Edwin didn't share the particular method he used to do it, he just told Julius to figure it out himself. Wrapping mana around an object was much harder than Edwin made it out to be. Julius's first attempts showed just how much finesse was required. He couldn't entirely wrap his mana around the ball he was using as practice. It was like he was trying to grab a wet bar of soap. The harder he tried, the more slippery it became. It was much easier to push the object in one direction or the other, but maintaining absolute control over its movements was another challenge entirely. Julius didn't think he could create such a delicate shell of mana around the ball as Edwin managed, but he thought he could brute force it. If Edwin's was like a layer of skin, his would be like an inflated sumo wrestler suit. It worked, kind of. Julius at least managed to control a single object with pure mana, but it was clunky and wasteful, and there was no way he could control more than one object with it. Therefore, the first thing he was going to practice was reducing how much mana he used to control an object. This is why he was holding the ball in the air above him, while slowly taking away layer by layer of mana until there was only a delicate shell like Edwin's, or the shaping failed, and he dropped it. Julius still hadn't told Edwin about removing his mana manipulation skill. He was too scared of what Edwin might do to him if he found out. But it also became even more motivation for him to practice his mana. Every day without fail, he would spend several hours finding creative ways to use mana while also still not wasting a single speck of it. Julius knew what kind of results challenging himself could have. Whenever he could, he was shaping mana into something. Even when he was getting beaten down by Edwin in the yard, he tried to maintain some mana. Due to his efforts, his ability to shape mana was coming along nicely. He could feel that his control was even beyond the level of when he had been using the skill. Also, with being able to accumulate mana now, Julius got a little greedier and controlled larger amounts at a time. This made it more difficult and wasteful, but it also increased his rate of improvement. To Julius, his success proved his hypothesis that mana manipulation was a crutch and that he was better off not learning it. He didn't know if that was true or not, but he was improving, and that was all he really cared about. Chapter 10, Tier 1. The day had finally arrived. Julius had spent countless hours accumulating as much mana as he could into himself. It was honestly the only slightly boring part of his training. There wasn't much variety he could do with it. He could try different methods of gathering mana, but most were less efficient than his usual technique. It didn't make sense to constantly try new techniques if they took more than twice as long to absorb the same amount. Julius did try to find ways to further compress his mana before he made his core. He didn't figure anything out, even after months of extensive testing and experimenting. He believed that liquid was the only state he would reach unless he wanted to spend another few years or decades trying to see if it was possible. At this point, liquid mana filled the entire space. He believed he could have done it yesterday, but he wanted to see if he could pack in any more beforehand and go at it with a fresh mind. Edwin had already shared the steps he was supposed to take to form his core with him. The most important thing was the intent. Julius needed to imagine all the mana merging with his body and soul. Right now, it was a mass of mana that was stored separately. What he wanted was for the mana to become a part of him, so that he could generate mana of his own. Julius was used to compressing the mana already inside him. The only difference now is that he needed to do the same to the shell surrounding the mana. The barrier that kept the mana contained needed to become smaller. Julius's main concern was that he had already compressed the mana until he couldn't anymore, so he didn't know what was going to happen. Logic says that since he was compressing what held the mana, it would compress the mana inside of it as well. Despite that, Julius had a feeling that wasn't how it worked. The mana inside of him wasn't actually contained within a physical barrier, it was just the easiest way that he was able to comprehend it. Who knows, there might be an interesting result after he creates his core. Regardless, Julius sat down and began the process. He envisioned the barrier around his mana shrinking. He wanted it to change into a sphere. It was the natural shape of celestial objects like planets, moons, and stars. It was also easier to mentally envision. For what seemed to be forever, Julius concentrated on compressing it into a smaller shape. He didn't make any progress, no matter how hard he tried. Maybe, compressing the mana itself beforehand wasn't a good idea, he thought to himself. Too late now, what's done is done. He didn't have the time or the focus to be worrying about what he should have done. He just needed to focus on the task at hand. Even with his improved mana manipulation, he couldn't generate enough force for it to compact together. Realizing that he was just wasting energy, he took a step back and thought about what he could do differently. For a long time, Julius just sat there, contemplating his options. Then he remembered Edwin saying intent was the most crucial aspect, so maybe his intent, or rather, his mental image of the process, was wrong. There was something he had to change. There wasn't enough force from the outside to compress it. That was the main issue. Wait, outside. There isn't enough force from the outside, but what about the inside? Julius was wondering whether he could use the same vortex method. He used a vortex to bring mana inside of him, but if he used it again, there would be nowhere for the mana to go. He didn't want to remove the mana, he just wanted to compress it. So that idea was out. But maybe he was onto something. He needed an internal force that simultaneously pulled the barrier into itself while smashing it from the outside to make it denser. The first thing that popped into his head was how gravity pulled various gases and particles into a star. Okay, He would use the image of gravity to act on the inside while he compressed it from the outside. Deciding on how he wanted to do it, he settled down and got to work. It was the same as before, just struggling to condense it, but with nothing happening. However, after some time had passed, he couldn't keep it up anymore and had to take a break. Taking a step back again, he looked at his mana. It was a beautiful combination of every color, sparkling like a rainbow lantern in the middle of the night. Wait a moment, it was smaller. Call me crazy, but I think it is actually smaller. He had spent several hours each day meditating, observing it, so he had a good idea of what it normally looked like. But right now, he could swear it looked just a hair smaller than usual. Julius didn't care that he might be seeing things. This was the best opportunity yet. He immediately jumped back into it and continued. This time, he wasn't going to stop until he formed his core. His entire soul struggled. It was like pushing a house-sized boulder up a hill. But with a supreme will, he commanded it to condense. He wasn't giving it an option anymore. He wasn't stopping until he accomplished forming his core. Julius wouldn't be denied. Suddenly, Julius felt the slightest give. Just the most subtle of movements. Noticing it was ever so slowly condensing, he redoubled his effort. He was squeezing every ounce of strength from his will as much as possible. All he cared about was forming his core. There was nothing else distracting him. It steadily picked up pace. It was no longer crawling and was continuing to accelerate. The boulder no longer felt like he was pushing it uphill. It was as if he had gotten over the crest, and now it was gaining momentum on the way down. It was scary. Julius could feel the force behind it. It was spreading throughout his body, suffusing his flesh with sheer power. He was becoming one with mana, but he didn't know if his body could take this amount of energy. Julius felt like his bones were being ground down into dust, his skin ripped out in chunks, and his brain doused in burning gasoline. Then, gone in an instant, the pain stopped. The force had reached a peak and was no longer increasing. Now his body was saturated by this force, and it sat comfortably throughout him. Julius felt like a new person, humming with untamed energy, incomparable to before. And sitting right in the middle of his body was a sphere radiating power. Julius let out a shaky breath. He had done it. For a second, there, he doubted whether or not he could succeed. But now Julius was officially Tier 1 and had taken the first step. He took a moment to inspect his newly formed core. It was a pure white orb surrounded by a glowing ring of soft white light. It was mesmerizing and comforting to feel, similar to a heated blanket and hot cocoa on a cold winter morning. Julius didn't have more time to investigate his core, because his door slammed open. Standing in his doorway were Edwin and Lucas, both with wide smiles. "Congratulations," Lucas yelled with his hands in the air. Edwin didn't say anything, but his smile was more than enough to show how proud he was. Julius laughed. It wasn't often the two of them took off their stoic masks and relaxed. But it was nice whenever they did. It always felt like they genuinely cared about him. "Thanks. You better watch out, old-timers. At this rate, I am going to leave you two behind," Julius teased. Lucas laughed good-naturedly and replied, "Maybe in a few centuries you will. Don't get cocky. You wouldn't want to be like the other noble kids, would ya?" Julius dramatically grimaced. "If I ever become like that, just put a sword in my stomach. It would be a more merciful end." They both laughed together, high on Julius's recent advancement. However, Edwin decided to step in. "I guess if you're feeling so confident, we should test out your new strength, huh?" "Bring it," he said with a cocky grin on his face. Half an hour later, Julius was lying face down in the dirt. I should not have said anything to him. Me and my big mouth. I got overconfident, he regretfully thought in his head. His overall strength had significantly increased. Everything from his speed, power, mental processing, and reflexes felt like they were on a whole other level. He ended up sparring with both of them, which was unusual because Lucas was normally very busy with house business and didn't have time to train with him. Now that he was Tier 1, he noticed that the whole world seemed to slow down compared to before. The previous him was always feeling like he was in a rush, that he was always a second behind his opponent. When they first started, he blitzed right out the gate at Edwin, trying to create an opening through sheer aggression. However, He now noticed he had more control over his actions. Before, he was just like a maniac, trying his hardest to get a hit on Edwin. But after he formed his core, he could plan out his strikes more effectively. Julius found a balance between aggression and anticipation. In that moment, he understood that the changes to his mind were probably the most impactful changes. Julius finally used spatial perception throughout the entire fight. He didn't realize it, but the skill allowed him to get an unnaturally good feeling for judging distance within strikes. He was now dodging punches and kicks by centimeters, which allowed him to get into a better position to counter. He knew exactly where he needed to be to punish their positioning. His uncle was much more fun to spar with than Edwin. Lucas spent time letting Julius get a feel for his new abilities and just casually defending while throwing some probing attacks. Generally, just allowing him to explore his new strength. Edwin, on the other hand, was like his normal self. He let Julius get acclimated to his strength for a couple of minutes. However, once he felt he had a good grasp, he cranked up his own strength. Edwin pummeled Julius black and blue. He didn't give Julius the chance to take the initiative, just bulldozing him. Edwin would even charge some mana into his strikes so that they either shocked or exploded with force on impact. Julius naturally tried to replicate him. While narrowly dodging for his life, he attempted to shape mana around his fist. Seeing an opportunity, Julius shifted his shoulder and ate a punch. However, this gave him a second to throw his mana-covered fist, glowing with a white aura. He managed to hit Edwin right in the stomach. To his and Edwin's surprise, it did nothing. Apparently, his strike was nothing more than a bright fist of light and a waste of mana. They both just paused. With Julius's fist still in his stomach, Edwin just looked down at him with extreme disappointment and judgmental eyes. Sighing, Edwin shook his head and leaned slightly back. Then the older man proceeded to Spartan kick the embarrassed Julius 20 feet across the yard.